On the 29th of August 1935, the bells of parish churches across Belgium started ringing before any government office had issued a single word explaining why. Nobody had to be told to grieve. News moved that day the way it moved before radio had fully caught up with tragedy. Mouth to mouth, market stall to market stall, telephone exchange to newspaper office, until by evening, strangers were standing on street corners in Brussels, crying over a woman most of them had never met and never would. She was 29 years old. 18 months earlier, her father-in-law had fallen to his death from a rock face he had climbed 100 times before. Now, his son had lost his wife on a lakeside road above a Swiss lake, in a car the king himself was driving. Her name was Astrid, Queen of the Belgians, and in 9 years on the Belgian throne, she had done something almost no European royal manages, even once in a lifetime. She had made an entire country genuinely, uncomplicatedly fond of her. This is the story of how she did that, how it ended in the time it takes to lose control of a car on a narrow road, and how the country she left behind spent the following 16 years proving, in public and in the worst possible way, exactly how much it had lost the day she died. Welcome back. If a story like this one is new to you, this channel spends its time on the women who stood beside the crowns rather than under them, the ones history tends to file as a footnote to somebody else's reign. Astrid never became a footnote. By the end of this, you will understand why Belgians, a century later, still leave flowers at a stone marker on a hillside outside a small Swiss town, for a queen almost none of them ever met in person. If you want more stories like hers when they come out, this is a good moment to subscribe. Now, to understand what Belgium lost that August afternoon, you have to go back 9 years, to a Swedish household nobody in Brussels had any particular reason to know about yet. Astrid was born in Stockholm on the 17th of November 1905, the third daughter of Prince Carl, a working naval officer who would go on to spend decades as head of the Swedish Red Cross, and Princess Ingeborg, a Danish princess who ran her household with a briskness that left little room for the kind of formality most people imagine when they picture European royalty. It was, by the standards of the courts around it, a plain kind of upbringing, closer to upper-middle-class Scandinavian than to gilded formality. Astrid and her sisters were raised to ride, to ski, to swim competitively, and to expect that their days would be organized around duty and exercise rather than display. She grew into a strong, unusually gifted skier by her teenage years, a detail that would sit strangely against the manner of her eventual death, and she spent enough winters on the slopes near the family's country house to be described by people who knew her then as more comfortable outdoors than in a drawing room, a trait she would carry with her into a marriage to a man who felt exactly the same way. Governesses who worked in the household later described a girl who disliked being fussed over, who preferred the stable to the reception room, and who could speak French and German fluently long before anyone thought to ask whether it would ever matter for a marriage abroad. The family split its year between a house in Stockholm and a country residence outside the city, and the 3 sisters grew up close enough that decades later, scattered across 3 different thrones in 3 different countries, they kept up a private correspondence in Swedish that outsiders were rarely shown. Astrid was, by most descriptions, the quietest of the 3 sisters in public and the most stubborn of the 3 in private, a combination that would serve her oddly well once she had a crown to wear and an entire country's expectations to manage without ever looking like she was managing anything at all. She is said to have told a friend, not long before the wedding, that she had never particularly wanted to be a queen, only Leopold's wife, and that the 2 things had simply arrived attached to each other in a way she had not thought to plan for. Margaretha, the eldest sister, married into the Danish royal family. Martha, the middle sister, married the future King of Norway, and would go on to become one of the more unexpectedly consequential royal women of the coming war, sheltering in exile in the United States and working the Roosevelt White House on Norway's behalf while her own country sat under German occupation, herself building a reputation for public warmth in an adopted country that closely mirrors the one her younger sister would build in Belgium. Astrid was the youngest of the three, and for most of her childhood, the least visible, the one nobody outside the family expected much of in particular, which makes what she went on to become in Belgium a little harder to have predicted from the outside. She met Leopold, Duke of Brabant, and heir to the Belgian throne, through the ordinary machinery of European royal life in the 1920s, the overlapping web of family weddings, house parties, and formal visits that put the marriageable sons and daughters of a dozen small monarchies in front of each other under careful supervision. Leopold was not, on paper, the catch his title implied. He was reserved to the point of appearing cold to people who did not know him well, more at ease outdoors than in a receiving line, uncomfortable with the theatre that came attached to his birth. As a teenager in the last 2 years of the First World War, he had insisted on serving as an ordinary private in the Belgian army. Rather than accepting an officer's commission his rank would have made automatic, a decision his father allowed and that shaped how the country initially read him, a prince willing to stand in the ranks rather than above them. He had grown up in the shadow of a father whose wartime record made him close to untouchable in Belgian public life, and by most accounts, Leopold carried that comparison uneasily, aware from an early age that whatever kind of king he eventually became, it would be measured against a man who had refused to surrender an entire country rather than his own comfort. What survives of the two of them from this period, in letters and in the recollections of people close to the match, suggests something rarer than a dynastic arrangement dressed up as romance. They appear, by most reasonable readings of the record, to have simply liked each other, and to have kept liking each other once the formal introductions were behind them and the actual business of being married had begun. Their engagement was announced in the autumn of 1926, and it was not entirely without friction back home in Belgium. Belgian succession law required the wife of a future king to be Catholic, and a segment of the Belgian press spent the weeks after the announcement raising the obvious question of a Lutheran Swedish princess marrying into a Catholic throne, coverage that read at times less like celebration and more like an audit. Astrid converted ahead of the wedding, a condition she seems to have accepted without the kind of public resistance some royal brides in comparable positions had shown elsewhere in Europe, and whatever reservations had circulated in print largely evaporated once Belgians saw her in person. She married Leopold twice within the space of a week that November, first in a civil ceremony in Stockholm, attended mostly by family, then in the religious ceremony Belgium cared about, held at the Cathedral of Saints Michael and Gudula in Brussels, a few days before her 21st birthday, in front of a congregation of foreign royalty and Belgian officials, while tens of thousands more filled the surrounding streets and squares, hoping for a glimpse of the procession on its way back to the palace. Crowds met her at the station before she had said a single public word in either French or Dutch. That detail matters more than it might sound like it should, because it was the first sign of something Belgium had not entirely expected from her. Photographs from those first years show a tall, fair-haired young woman who tended to be caught mid-gesture rather than posed still, laughing at something outside the frame, bending down to a child's height at a public event rather than staying upright and letting the child be lifted to her instead. Small choices that a palace press office in a later decade might have engineered on purpose, and that in Astrid's case appear, by the testimony of people who watched her do it repeatedly over years, to have simply been how she moved through a room. She dressed well without dressing extravagantly, favoured plain lines over heavy ornamentation, even at formal events where heavier ornamentation was expected. and struck more than one visiting foreign journalist as someone who would have been just as recognizable in a department store as at a state banquet. A comparison meant, in the period, as a real compliment rather than the faint criticism it might read as today. Once she was actually living in Brussels, Astrid worked at fitting into a culture that was not naturally hers, with a deliberateness that struck people at court as unusual for a princess who had married in from outside. She took her Dutch and French lessons seriously enough that Belgian newspapers occasionally printed approving notices about her progress, the way a school might report on a promising pupil. She adopted a particular shade of pale blue as something close to a personal signature, worn often enough in public appearances and in the fashion photography of the period that Belgian dressmakers began marketing the colour under her name, an early and slightly absurd piece of evidence that she had become a public taste in her own right, rather than merely a public figure. None of it read as calculated to the people around her at the time. She behaved, in public, the way a well-liked private person behaves, and Belgium had simply never had a member of its royal family do that quite so naturally before. To understand why any of that mattered as much as it did, it helps to remember what kind of country Astrid had married into. Belgium was, at the time, barely a century old, stitched together in 1830 out of provinces that spoke Dutch in the north and French in the south, and had never fully agreed on what held them together beyond the border drawn around them. The monarchy existed, in part, precisely to be the one institution both halves of the country could point to without having to pick a side, which put an enormous amount of pressure on whoever happened to be sitting on the throne to behave like they belonged to both halves rather than one. Kings could do this through formality and distance. It took a queen willing to learn both languages properly and be seen using them to do it through something warmer. The Belgian royal family in the 1920s commanded real respect, most of it inherited from Albert I's wartime record as the soldier king who had refused to surrender his country when Germany invaded in 1914. Choosing instead to lead what remained of his army from a strip of unoccupied Belgian coastline for 4 years, rather than flee into comfortable exile, the way several other European monarchs in his position might have. Respect of that kind is not the same thing as affection, and affection is what Astrid brought with her, apparently without trying very hard to earn it. She learned French and learned Dutch, both, seriously, in a country where language politics could sink a public figure who was seen to favour one side over the other, a divide that ran under nearly every institution in Belgian life, and that the monarchy had always relied on staying visibly above rather than choosing a side within. She turned up at hospitals without warning the photographers first. More than one newspaper of the period noted, with something close to surprise, that she was occasionally seen driving herself through parts of Brussels a royal wife was not expected to know existed, let alone visit unaccompanied. Papers that had spent years producing dutiful, formal copy about the Belgian court started writing about her the way people write about someone they have come to like, rather than merely someone they are obliged to cover. Part of what made this possible was new, and it was bigger than Astrid herself. The 1920s and 30s were the first era in which mass media, illustrated weeklies, newsreels, shown before the feature at the cinema, made royal figures visible to ordinary people in a way earlier generations of monarchs never had been. A king or queen was no longer only a face on a coin and a name in a column of court circular items. They were a moving image people watched from a theatre seat, occasionally a voice that came through a household radio set. Astrid, young, photogenic, visibly at ease around ordinary people rather than performing ease for a camera, was unusually well suited to that new kind of visibility, and Belgium responded to her accordingly, at a moment when several other European monarchies were struggling to hold public sympathy at all against the economic strain of the Depression and the rise of Republican and fascist movements pressing on their borders. She and Leopold settled into Stuyvenberg Castle on the edge of Brussels as Duke and Duchess of Brabant and had 3 children in quick succession. Josephine Charlotte arrived in October of 1927, and photographs of the new mother with her infant daughter, deliberately released to the Belgian press rather than kept private the way earlier generations of the court might have preferred, did more for the family's public image in a single week than years of formal portraits had managed. Baudouin followed in September of 1930. The same year, Belgium marked a century of independence, with international exhibitions in Liège and Antwerp that the young Duke and Duchess attended as part of the national centenary celebrations. One more occasion on which newsreel cameras caught Astrid smiling into a crowd rather than merely standing at the edge of one. Albert, the youngest, was born in June of 1934. At the time of his birth, nobody around Astrid had any particular reason to think she would not be alive to see either of her sons crowned, let alone both of them, decades apart, in a century that had not yet shown its full hand. Then, in February of 1934, 4 months before Albert was born, the Belgian monarchy took the first of 2 blows that would come to define the rest of the decade. King Albert I, Leopold's father, and the man whose wartime reputation still propped up much of the dynasty's standing, went climbing alone at a rock face near Namur called Marche les Dames, a route he had climbed dozens of times before and treated as routine exercise rather than adventure. He did not come back down. When he failed to return by evening, local search parties were organized, and it was a pair of quarry workers, not the official rescue party, who eventually spotted his body at the base of the rock face early the following morning, his climbing rope still coiled uselessly nearby. The news reached Leopold and Astrid at Stuyvenberg before it had even been confirmed to the wider public, and Astrid, by then several months pregnant with Albert, was reportedly the one who had to help steady Leopold enough to receive the officials arriving at the door. He was 58, and the manner of his death, a soldier king who had survived 4 years of trench warfare, killed by an afternoon's hobby, was strange enough that conspiracy theories about it have never fully gone away, even a century later, some insisting the fall was staged to cover something else entirely, though no serious historian has ever produced evidence to support that, and the more mundane explanation that an experienced climber made one small mistake on a route he had stopped respecting because he knew it too well, has always been the more credible one. Albert's widow, Queen Elizabeth, buried her husband that February, and then, 18 months later, stood at the grave of her son's wife as well, 2 of the people closest to her, lowered into the same royal crypt within a year and a half of each other, while she herself went on living for another 3 decades. Well into the 1960s, long enough to watch 2 of Astrid's own children take turns wearing the crown, her husband and her daughter-in-law had each held so briefly themselves. Grief, in that particular family, was rarely given the chance to finish one round before the next one started. Leopold became king that same month, with Astrid beside him as queen, both of them pushed into the role years earlier than either had planned for, and with barely any time to grieve before the machinery of a new reign started running. Belgian monarchs are never crowned in the way the word usually suggests. There is no jeweled ceremony, no anointing, only a constitutional oath sworn before Parliament, which meant the transition from Duke and Duchess of Brabant to King and Queen of the Belgians happened almost administratively, a swearing-in rather than a spectacle, and it happened within days of a funeral rather than months after one, the black of mourning barely off before the plain civic oath was taken. Astrid was 28, with a newborn coming in 4 months, and a country now looking to her not as a foreign-born princess who had married in well, but as its queen, full stop, at the exact moment the family occupying the throne had just lost the one figure who had made that throne feel unshakable to most Belgians alive to remember the war. She did not shrink from it. If anything, the 18 months between Albert's death and her own are the period her admirers point to first when they try to explain what Belgium lost. She threw herself into causes that had almost nothing to do with royal ceremony and everything to do with what the country needed at the tail end of a hard decade: infant health, maternity care, support for working-class mothers who had none of the resources the court took for granted. She was a regular, largely unannounced presence in maternity wards and children's hospitals in Brussels and beyond, at a time when a queen's public schedule was still, for the most part, expected to consist of ribbon cuttings and formal receptions rather than actual bedside visits. She lent her time to campaigns against tuberculosis and infant mortality that had almost nothing glamorous about them, and offered nothing back to her in the way of good publicity beyond the fact that people noticed she kept showing up. People who worked alongside her on that kind of program, rather than merely posing beside her for a photograph, described her afterward as present for the work in a way that held up rather than merely attached to it for appearances. She was also, by several accounts, uninterested in the layers of protocol that normally separated a monarch from the people receiving whatever charity she was distributing, occasionally sitting down at the bedside of a patient rather than standing over it. A small physical choice that cost her nothing and that ordinary nurses and hospital staff apparently noticed and talked about long after any given visit had ended. It built a specific kind of reputation, harder to manufacture than popularity built on appearances alone, the sense among people who crossed paths with her that she behaved the same way whether a camera was present or not. None of this happened in isolation from the wider mood of the continent, and 1935 was already a heavy year on the continent, for reasons that had nothing to do with her. Italy invaded Ethiopia that same autumn. Germany had begun openly rearming in violation of the treaty that ended the last war, and the Nuremberg laws were passed that same September, days after Astrid's funeral. Europe's smaller constitutional monarchies were watching larger, angrier political movements rise around them and increasingly wondering how much longer public affection for any inherited crown would hold. Against that backdrop, a queen personally liked by an entire country, not merely respected by it, read, to more than a few contemporary observers, like proof that a monarchy could still function on something other than fear or nostalgia. Her death took that proof away, at almost exactly the moment Europe most needed to believe it. Belgians, across the language and class divides that made national unity hard to find on almost any other subject, started calling her simply Astrid. Not Her Majesty, not the Queen. Astrid, the way you refer to someone in your own family. Historians of the period still reach for the phrase that attached itself to her even while she was alive, the People's Queen, at a moment when most of Europe's monarchies were losing exactly that kind of ordinary public affection rather than gaining it, and when the wider continent was only a few years from finding out how badly some of those same monarchies would need whatever public goodwill they had left. That spring, months before the crash, newsreel cameras caught her at the Brussels World's Fair, informal, working a crowd of exhibition visitors the way a popular public figure works a room, rather than the way a monarch performs a scheduled appearance. It was, without anyone knowing it at the time, close to the last footage of her the country would ever see taken while she was simply enjoying herself, rather than performing a role for an audience that expected one. What happens in the second half of this, both to Astrid and, years later, to the monarchy she left behind, is not the part of Belgian history most people ever learn. By the summer of 1935, Leopold and Astrid had been king and queen for a year and a half, and by every surviving account, they still functioned as something rarer among royal marriages than either of their titles. Two people who preferred each other's company off-duty as much as on it. Leopold, like his late father, found relief from the formality of the crown in mountains and outdoor sport. a passion the two men shared in a way that made his father's death by climbing accident feel like an especially cruel piece of foreshadowing in hindsight, one that nobody around the family seems to have taken as a warning at the time, because why would they have? That August, the family arranged a private holiday in Switzerland, away from the Belgian press, and largely without the security a modern royal trip would carry as standard practice. They stayed near Küsnacht am Rigi, a small town on the shore of Lake Lucerne, the kind of hushed alpine setting where, for a few days at least, a king could be mostly just a man on holiday with his wife, rather than a head of state under permanent observation, taking walks along the lake and driving themselves, rather than relying on staff for every errand. It was not their first trip of this kind. The family had taken similar holidays in the Alps before, skiing in winter and hiking in summer, informal enough that Belgian newspapers sometimes only learned the royal family had left the country after they were already back. Astrid, the strong skier from her Swedish childhood, kept up with Leopold on terrain that would have exhausted most of the court officials, who occasionally tried to accompany them and generally gave up after a day or two. The couple had spent the days before the 29th much the way they had spent similar days on earlier trips, walking, swimming in the lake, driving out to look at the scenery without any particular destination in mind, the sort of unstructured time neither of them got much of once they were back across the Belgian border. On the afternoon of the 29th, the two of them set out driving along the lakeside road, Leopold at the wheel, Astrid beside him, without a chauffeur, which was itself part of what made the trip feel ordinary rather than official. What happened over the next few minutes has never settled into a single uncontested account, and the confusion started immediately in the earliest wire reports out of Switzerland, some of which contradicted each other within hours on basic details before the facts had time to catch up with the speed of the news. One version, repeated in several of the period's newspaper reports, has Astrid reaching for a road map or leaning toward the windshield to look at the view, distracting Leopold at the exact wrong moment on a narrow stretch of road cut close to the water. Another, closer to what Leopold himself said afterward, has a cyclist appearing suddenly ahead of them, forcing him to swerve to avoid a collision he would not have survived either way if he had not reacted. What both versions agree on is the outcome. The car left the road, went down an embankment toward the lake, and struck a tree. Leopold was thrown clear and badly injured, with broken ribs and a head wound that would leave a visible scar for the rest of his life. Astrid was thrown from the vehicle as well and suffered fatal head injuries, dying either instantly or within minutes, depending on which of the period's conflicting reports you find most credible. Local residents reached the wreckage before any official help arrived, and a doctor from the nearby town was called to the scene within the hour, though there was little left for medicine to do by the time he got there. Leopold, badly hurt himself, reportedly would not leave her side until he was physically made to, an image that made its way into several of the earliest newspaper accounts and stayed attached to the story long after more clinical details of the crash had been forgotten by everyone except historians. Swiss authorities opened a formal inquiry in the days that followed, standard practice for any fatal accident on a public road, regardless of who was involved, and closed it without assigning criminal blame, treating it as exactly what the evidence supported, a tragic loss of control, rather than any kind of negligence worth prosecuting. That finding did little to settle the matter in the court of public speculation, where it has been relitigated in one form or another ever since. She was 29. She had been queen for a year and a half. Her youngest child was 14 months old, too young to ever hold a real memory of her, and her eldest was not yet 8. The 3 children were back in Belgium at the time, in the care of household staff, and were told what had happened by people who were not their parents, because their father was still in a Swiss hospital bed, too injured to travel home immediately himself. Josephine Charlotte, old enough at 7 to understand roughly what death meant, reportedly asked repeatedly in the days afterward when her mother was coming back, a detail that surfaces in more than one account of the household that week, and that nobody who repeats it seems to find easy to say without pausing first. Baudouin, not yet 5, and Albert, barely more than a year old, were both too young to register the change as anything more than an absence they could not name yet, which in its own way may have been the smaller mercy of the two. We will come back to what Belgium did with its grief in the weeks that followed, because it tells you almost as much about the country as the marriage did. If you have not already, this is a good place to subscribe, because the second half of this story, what her death did to Leopold, and what it eventually did to the Belgian crown itself, is the part almost nobody outside Belgium actually knows. News of the crash reached Brussels within hours, and the state did not have to organize a public reaction, because one organized itself before the government had finished drafting its own official statement. Astrid's body was brought home by train, and at every station along the route through Switzerland, then France, then finally across the Belgian border, crowds gathered on the platforms in total silence to watch the funeral car pass, in numbers that reportedly surprised even officials who had already expected a significant response. By the time the train crossed into Belgium, the crowds had stopped being merely large and become close to impossible for local police to manage, without extra men called in from neighbouring towns. Brussels, on the day of the funeral in early September, went further than any official mourning protocol required. Shopkeepers who owed the crown nothing closed their doors without being asked to. Families with no connection to the court at all hung black cloth from their own windows, a gesture ordinarily reserved for a death inside the family itself. The funeral procession moved the short distance from the royal residence at Laeken to the nearby Church of Our Lady, where Belgium's monarchs have been buried since the country's first king, along streets that under ordinary circumstances carried market traffic and tram bells, and on that day carried nothing at all, drapers' shops still hanging the black cloth they had put up the previous week as the cortege passed. People had been arriving before dawn to claim a place along the route, standing for hours in a late summer heat nobody had thought to plan around, and the crowd stayed several deep for the entire distance. In a silence multiple foreign correspondents covering the funeral specifically remarked on in their dispatches, because a crowd that size staying that quiet is its own kind of statement, harder to fake than applause, and harder to ignore than tears. Newsreel companies filmed the procession at a length usually reserved for the death of a head of government rather than a royal consort, and the footage played in Belgian cinemas for weeks afterward to audiences that, by several accounts, sat through it in something close to the same silence the crowds on the street had kept. Leopold, still recovering from injuries sustained in the same crash, walked part of the route rather than riding, visibly in pain, which only deepened the public's sense that they were watching a man who had actually lost something, rather than a king performing loss for an audience that expected it of him. Sweden observed its own period of mourning for the daughter it had sent abroad 9 years earlier, flags lowered across Stockholm on the day of the funeral itself. Astrid's father, by then an old man who had spent decades running the Swedish Red Cross rather than reigning over anything, travelled to Brussels for the funeral, along with her sisters, 3 grieving Scandinavian royal women standing together in a Belgian church none of them had been raised to think of as home. Telegrams of condolence arrived from monarchs and heads of state across Europe, several of whom made the journey to Brussels for the funeral in person, rather than sending a representative, an honour not automatically extended to every royal death of the period. In the years that followed, Belgium did what countries often do when a public figure dies in a way that ordinary channels of grief cannot fully absorb. It built things to put the feeling somewhere permanent. A memorial cross and small chapel went up near the crash site outside Küsnacht, which still stands today and which Belgian visitors to Switzerland occasionally still make a point of finding, even now, generations removed from anyone who could have known her personally. Inside Belgium itself, town after town named a park, a square, or a hospital in her memory: an Astrid Park in Brussels, an Astrid Square in Antwerp near the central station, a Queen Astrid military hospital that still treats patients today, an Astrid Boulevard in more than one provincial town, until it became entirely possible to grow up in Belgium walking past her name on public buildings for years before ever learning who she actually was or how she died. A country that had spent 9 years falling for a foreign-born princess spent the following decades making certain nobody forgot exactly why. Belgian mints and postal services issued coins and commemorative stamps carrying her image in the years after her death, a small but telling sign of how thoroughly the state itself had absorbed her into its own sense of identity, rather than merely marking her passing and moving on. In the days after the crash, Flemish and French-language newspapers, which rarely agreed on very much, and often used the same events to make entirely opposing political points, ran coverage of her death that was, for once, almost indistinguishable from each other in tone. Grief over Astrid was one of the only things in 1930s Belgium that briefly did not split along the country's usual line. It would be exactly that line, reopened, that eventually ended her husband's reign. Inside the crypt at the Church of Our Lady in Laeken, Astrid's tomb sits near those of the kings and queens who came before and after her, visited today mostly by tourists working through a checklist of Brussels sites rather than by anyone carrying personal memory of her, which is, in its own way, exactly what happens to every royal grave eventually, no matter how large the crowds were on the day it was first sealed. What the plaques and park names generally leave out is what happened next to the man she left behind, and through him, to the monarchy she had spent 9 years making the country love. Because if Astrid's death marked the end of the golden years of the Belgian crown, the 16 years that followed were the proof of it, laid out almost like a country working through a grief it never got to finish. In the 5 years between the crash and the war, Leopold governed as a widower who by most accounts never fully set the loss down. He did not remarry during those years, wore mourning for an unusually long stretch even by the standards expected of a royal widower, and reportedly kept a small number of Astrid's personal effects with him at Laeken rather than in storage, the sort of small private detail that people around him noticed without ever being told to. Publicly, his energy went into foreign policy rather than sentiment. In October of 1936, he pushed Belgium away from its long-standing military alliance with France and toward a formal policy of neutrality, a decision meant to keep the country out of a war many could already see coming, and one that would leave Belgium diplomatically isolated and militarily uncoordinated with its neighbours when that war arrived 4 years later. It is one of the sharper ironies of the whole period that the policy meant to protect the country Astrid had loved so visibly is part of what left her husband so unprepared to defend it. 5 years after the crash, Germany invaded Belgium as the Second World War reached the country, and Leopold, as commander of the Belgian army, made the decision that would come to define the rest of his reign more than anything he did before or after it. In May of 1940, with his forces collapsing under the German advance, he surrendered without consulting his own government, which had already relocated abroad to keep fighting from exile. The French Prime Minister of the day denounced the surrender on the radio within hours, calling it an act close to betrayal of the Allied cause, and the label stuck to Leopold in parts of the foreign press for years afterward. Then, rather than following his ministers into exile the way his father almost certainly would have done, Leopold chose to remain in occupied Belgium, effectively confined to his own palace at Laeken for most of the rest of the war, and eventually deported to Germany and then Austria in the war's final year as advancing Allied forces pushed closer, held there under guard, alongside his second wife and children, until liberation finally reached them in 1945. For most of those years, he had no real access to news of how his own reputation was faring back home, which meant he returned from the war to a country whose opinion of him had hardened in ways he had not been present to argue against or explain. A strange kind of exile within his own biography, physically confined by one government and reputationally tried in absentia by his own people at the same time. A document Leopold wrote in 1944, intended as a private explanation of his conduct and later leaked into public circulation, made things worse rather than better once it surfaced, since parts of it read to critics as sympathetic to a post-authoritarian style of governance rather than as the plain wartime survival account Leopold apparently believed he was writing. By the time he was free to speak for himself again after the liberation, the version of events already fixed in the Belgian public imagination had had years to harden without him in the room to push back on it. To some Belgians, staying had looked like solidarity, a king refusing to abandon his people to occupation while his government fled abroad. To many others, including his own ministers, it looked like something closer to capitulation, an uncomfortable contrast to his father's flat refusal to yield an inch of Belgian territory 2 decades earlier. The soldier king's son, married to the most beloved queen Belgium had ever had, spent the defining crisis of his reign looking, to a large share of his own country, like the wrong kind of king entirely, at the exact moment the country most needed to believe in the kind of king his father had been. Then, in September of 1941, still confined at Laeken under German occupation, while Belgium endured the hardest years of the war, Leopold remarried. His new wife, Lilian Bales, was a commoner, the daughter of a former Belgian government minister, 20 years younger than Leopold, and only a few years older than his own eldest child. The two had reportedly known each other socially before the war, through her father's political circles, in the ordinary way a king might come to know the adult daughter of a minister he worked with, though nothing in the record suggests the relationship became serious until well after Astrid's death, and the country's occupation had both already reshaped Leopold's daily life, almost beyond recognition. The ceremony was conducted with little fanfare, first as a religious rite, and it did not stay private for long, once word of it spread beyond the palace walls. For a country whose most treasured public memory was still, 6 years on, a queen who had died on a Swiss road at 29, a wartime remarriage to a much younger commoner, read to a great many Belgians as something close to a betrayal, not necessarily of any promise Leopold had personally made, but of the collective memory the whole country had built around Astrid in the years since her death. Lilian was given the title Princess de Retty rather than Queen, a deliberate and telling distinction meant to signal that she would never formally occupy Astrid's place, and in the public imagination she never came close to occupying it, regardless of the title, without seeming to try quite as hard as Astrid once had, or perhaps without ever being given the chance to, by a public that had already decided what a Belgian queen was supposed to look like. The war ended with Leopold's position more damaged than before, not less. Questions about his surrender in 1940 and his conduct through the occupation followed him for the rest of the decade in what Belgians came to call, simply, the royal question, a national argument over whether the king could legitimately return to a throne he had technically never given up. It split the country almost exactly along the fault lines that had always run under Belgian politics, Flanders largely sympathetic to Leopold, Wallonia largely and often furiously opposed, the same linguistic and regional divide the monarchy had always relied on, rising above rather than embodying. With Leopold barred from returning, and no monarch able to formally reign in his place, his younger brother, Prince Charles, governed the country as regent for 6 years, from 1944 to 1950. an arrangement nobody had planned for, and that only underlined how completely the crisis had outgrown anything the Belgian constitution had been built to handle cleanly. Leopold and his family spent much of this same period in exile in Switzerland, waiting on a resolution that took the better part of those same 5 years to arrive, while a series of Belgian governments rose and fell, trying and failing to settle the question through Parliament alone. The referendum campaign itself split families as much as it split provinces, with posters and pamphlets on both sides invoking Astrid's memory almost as often as they invoked Leopold's wartime conduct, his supporters arguing that a king who had once given the country its most beloved queen deserved forgiveness, his opponents arguing that exactly this history made his choices in 1940 and 1941 harder to excuse rather than easier. A referendum in 1950 produced a bare national majority in his favour, thin enough and regionally lopsided enough that it settled nothing at all in practice. Leopold returned to Belgium that summer anyway, and the result was not reconciliation but open unrest, general strikes, mass demonstrations, and in the industrial towns of Wallonia, protesters shot and killed by police during clashes the government could not contain, most notoriously near the town of Grasse-Berleur, outside Liège. Marches converged on Brussels from across the industrial south, and for a few weeks that summer, Belgium looked less like a constitutional monarchy managing a political dispute and more like a country standing at the edge of something considerably worse, close enough to serious civil conflict that the government of the day began preparing contingency plans in case the crisis escalated further. Leopold transferred his royal powers to his son Baudouin within weeks and formally abdicated the following year, in 1951, in Baudouin's favour. He lived another 22 years, largely outside public life, spending much of his later time on travel and natural history expeditions far from the country he had once ruled, remembered by history less for the reign he built than for the two crises, one in 1940, one in 1950, that came to define it almost completely. Baudouin, for his part, spent much of his own long reign deliberately building a different kind of public image than his father's, careful, restrained, visibly devout, a working king rather than a wartime one, as though the crown itself had learned something permanent from watching what happened when a Belgian monarch lost the public's trust and could not find a way to earn it back. His own reign was not without its own crises either, most sharply in 1960, when Belgium granted independence to the Congo in a rushed and violently unstable handover that did lasting damage to the country's reputation abroad. A very different kind of national reckoning than the one his father had lived through, but proof that the throne Astrid had once made so easy to love had never stopped being difficult to hold. Laid out end to end, what happened between 1934 and 1951 reads almost like a single unbroken chain rather than a string of unrelated events. A king dies, falling from a mountain he had climbed 100 times. His son inherits a throne he was not ready for, married to a woman who, in a year and a half, does more for the monarchy's popularity than most royals manage across an entire lifetime. Then she dies too, in another accident, on another mountain road, and everything that had made the crown feel loved rather than merely respected dies with her. The son left holding her loss instead of her gift spends the next 16 years making one decision after another that a country still grieving her would not forgive him for: a wartime surrender, a wartime remarriage, and finally a referendum result too thin to hold the country together, until the only way through was to hand the throne to someone else entirely. Astrid's own children lived out that whole arc without her. Josephine Charlotte, 7 years old when her mother died, grew up to become Grand Duchess of Luxembourg, marrying Grand Duke Jean and raising the next generation of that country's royal family largely out of the Belgian spotlight her mother had known. Baudouin, not yet 5 at the time of the crash, became the king Belgium accepted in his father's place in 1951, married Fabiola de Mora y Aragon in 1960, and reigned for more than 4 decades, largely credited with rebuilding the public trust his father had spent, though his own reign was not free of controversy. Briefly stepping aside for a single day in 1990, rather than sign an abortion law his Catholic conscience would not allow him to approve, a strange, muted echo of just how differently the Belgian crown had learned to navigate conflict since his father's era. He died in 1993 without an heir of his own. Albert, 14 months old on the day of the crash, and with effectively no memory of his mother at all, became king in his brother's place, reigning until his own abdication in 2013 in favour of his son, Philippe, the great-grandson Astrid never lived to imagine, let alone meet, who sits on the Belgian throne to this day, 4 generations removed from a woman he knows only through photographs, park benches, and the name on a hospital he has probably visited without thinking twice about where it came from. 2 of her 3 children wore the crown she never saw either of them wear, in a country that, in a very literal sense, spent most of the rest of the century still working through what it lost the afternoon her car went off a Swiss road. Albert, who grew up with no real memory of his mother at all, named his own daughter Astrid, a small private act of naming that turned into another public one the moment the announcement was made. One more Astrid for Belgium to read about in the newspapers, born into a royal family that had never really stopped talking about the first one. The crash itself never entirely stopped generating its own folklore either. Tabloids in later decades occasionally revived the idea of a family curse, pointing to a father and daughter-in-law killed within 18 months of each other in almost identical circumstances, a mountain fall and a mountain road, as though the Belgian monarchy had truly angered something rather than simply suffered 2 unrelated, ordinary accidents in unusually quick succession. Serious historians have always been dismissive of that framing, for good reason, but the fact that it kept resurfacing at all, generation after generation, says something about how hard it has been for Belgium to file Astrid's death away as a plain accident, and leave it there. She has been dead now for the better part of a century, and Belgium has still not entirely let her go. Her name sits on hospitals and parks and public squares in cities she visited exactly once, or never at all. A stone marker on a remote hillside outside a small Swiss town most Belgians will never travel to still gets flowers left at it, from visitors who were not alive when she died, and whose grandparents were not alive either. There are queens who reign for 50 years and leave less behind them than Astrid left in 9. The storm that actually broke over Belgium that August was never in the sky above Kusnacht. It broke at home in the years afterward, every single time the country tried and failed to find another version of her, through a wartime surrender it could not forgive, a wartime marriage it would not accept, and a referendum result too thin to settle anything. And in a strange way it is still breaking, quietly, every time a Belgian drives past a square named for a queen they were never taught much about beyond her name and the shape of the tragedy that made it famous. Every queen who has followed her onto the Belgian throne has been measured against her, whether anyone said so out loud or not. Fabiola, gracious and privately devout, spent 4 decades as queen, and never became a folk figure the way Astrid did in 9 years. Paula, glamorous in her own right as Albert's queen, carried her own complicated history with the Belgian press, rather than the uncomplicated affection Astrid had somehow generated almost immediately. Mathilde, the current queen, is by most measures the most popular member of the family in a generation, and even her popularity gets discussed in Belgian commentary with half an eye on the comparison, as though the country has never quite stopped keeping the scorecard it started building in 1926. What makes Astrid different from most of the royal women whose stories end in a car crash or a plane going down is that almost nothing about her actual reign gave the tragedy its weight. She did not die in the middle of a scandal, or a divorce, or a decade of public disappointment that made her death read like a release. She died at the exact peak of being loved, before Belgium had any reason to feel anything about her, except affection, which is part of why the country built so much around her name, instead of simply letting her fade the way most consorts eventually do. A queen who reigns long enough accumulates complicated feelings the way any long relationship does. Astrid never got the chance, and Belgium has spent the better part of a century treating that unfinished quality less like a wound to close and more like a shrine to keep polished. Those church bells that started ringing on their own across Belgium on the 29th of August 1935, before any government had told anyone what to feel, are not ringing for her anymore. Most of the people who heard them that day are gone too now. But the country they rang over kept building her a kind of permanence that outlasted the grief itself, in stone crosses on foreign hillsides and hospital wards, and the names of granddaughters, which is either the strangest form of national memory or simply the most honest one, depending on how much you think a nation actually owes the people it loved and lost too early. If this is the kind of story you come back for, the ones where a private tragedy and a national one turn out to be the same event, this channel has more of them waiting, and the best way to catch the next one is to subscribe before you go. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.